Hello, my name is Brittany Rivers, and today I'm going to be talking about mental health and reproductive justice. I originally did this presentation for Planned Parenthood, and I will put a link in the description if you would like to donate to them, as unfortunately their organization is under attack right now, and they are at risk of losing funding, which means that many people will lose access to their reproductive health care. So, a little bit about my professional background. I graduated from the UF Counselor Education Program in 2015. I've been licensed since 2018, and I believe I started private practice at the end of 2019, right before the pandemic started. I've worked in pretty much every level of care. Some of the issues that I work with are trauma, substance use, self injurious behavior, suicidal ideation, OCD, and eating disorders. Many of my clients are in the queer and neurodivergent communities. I also work with spirituality and incorporating nature into the therapy space, and also supporting individuals that are struggling with emotions associated with climate change. Some of my positionality, just how I orient myself, so you can know a little bit of that, and maybe also some of the limitations that I may have. Is I'm white, middle class, fat, queer, neurocomplex, a settler, chronically ill, and navigating disability. I'm actively working to integrate and center Indigenous people of the global majority and decolonizing perspectives into my work. Some of my bloodline, part of that decolonizing perspective is really to hold the context of my lineage and what brought me to where I am today or where we are today. This is some of the places that some of my ancestors are from. And also, I actively engage with what I call my landline, or um, the relations or relatives of the lands that I live with, which includes finding ways to honor the Indigenous ancestors of the lands that I live with, and also actively engaging the more than human relations as well. All right, so what is reproductive justice? Sister Song defines reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. Although this language was used previously, it was more formalized in the 1990s by a group called Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, who I believe later evolved into Sister Song. It's looking at combining reproductive and social justice. So, part of this is really acknowledging the limitations of the women's rights movement that was led primarily by middle class and white women. So, some of the limitations is this difference between choice and access. So, maybe we technically, legally have a right to something. So, on paper, it looks like we have a choice. However, when we take a step back and expand our view, we can see that for some people in our community, there's a lot of things that actually affect their access to making that choice. And accessibility has a big impact on what choices they decide or what choices they actually tangibly have in terms of their lives and what's going on for them and the systems that they're having to navigate. So, reproductive justice expands out away from just looking at, do we have the choice to do this or that? Is something legal or not? But also addressing all of the pieces that play into how accessible those choices are. So, this may be looking at things like contraception, comprehensive sex education, um, sexually transmitted infection prevention and care, alternative birth options, adequate prenatal and pregnancy care, domestic violence assistance, adequate wages that support families and safe homes, and many other things. Sister Song notes that they do things like analyze power systems, address intersecting oppressions, center the most marginalized, and work to join together across issues and identities. So in a way, it's really looking at human rights through the lens of the nuanced ways oppression impacts self-determined family creation. So what I want to note there for myself and some of my experiences is when I have been part of, for example, white-led organizations focusing on climate change, for example, there's a lot of siloing. And this is some of the ways that whiteness impacts structures and systems, is really siloing them off into separate categories and to really avoid um, in different ways or challenge looking at how things are integrated and interconnected. And so I have been in situations where I've really been challenged when I'm trying to bring up these uh, decolonizing perspectives where people are like, but I thought we were just supposed to be talking about this environmental thing. When we look at things more broadly, everything relates to what's happening with the environment. For example, there's so many issues where this is playing out in other ways, like which communities, like I think I read recently that Elon Musk, for example, was putting up a data processing plant that was running off methane gas, which is one of the most harmful things to burn in a Black community. Why did he decide to put it there? Or when we opt to dump nuclear waste um, upstream from Indigenous communities, or to engage in really extractive, harmful processes in communities where of lower income, for example. So there's so many ways that these issues are integrate or really we can paint broad strokes, and that maybe potentially we would have more efficacy in terms of these movements if we really did look at these integrated way of seeing it. For example, adequate wages listed here. That affects everybody. Are people making enough money to support families? We could also look at, are they making enough money to provide for themselves and whatever they want to do, whether or not that includes having children. So it really looks at things in this broader way and really contextualizes things, I think, in a more integrative way when we're looking at things from this reproductive justice lens. And of course, there's so much more that we could say for this, but this was set up for a pretty short presentation. So I do want to note that some of the research is also kind of limited. Like we could look at many of these other things and trace them back to maybe reproductive health. However, that sort of bias where the focus is on abortion rights is a primary focus with some of the research that I found. So I do want to acknowledge that limitation. And also, how do we define women? So that was brought up as a limitation of some of these studies, is how do we define women? And is that inclusive of the queer community, of the trans community, or not? How do we define this? So that is also a limitation, is looking at things in more of this binary lens. So some of the limits on reproductive health can trigger things like trauma, stress, anxiety, and worry. This was a big one that I think is very challenging to some of the rhetoric that, like, oh, just give the child up for adoption, is that women who relinquish children to adoption actually suffer more psychological trauma than women who have abortion or whose children have died, which that's pretty huge, as one of maybe the biggest traumas maybe we could think of as someone who had lost a child to death. But you could just, if I think about this from a mental health perspective, I could think about all of the pieces, or some of the pieces that may play into why that causes more psychological trauma. One may be that an individual is forced to carry a child to term that they did not want to have, so how that impacted their bodily autonomy, that they did not have the support that they needed throughout that process, or were forced into doing, again, something that they didn't want to do, but also sort of what's happening biologically in that process. Like one of the things that, and this doesn't always, it's not always the case, but some of the things that we're sort of hardwired into is this connection between um, the parent and child, is such a fundamental thing that we are uh, generally biologically hardwired to. And so when all of those processes are happening within someone, all of those hormones are fluctuating and changing to build that bond and relationship, and then to have it severed. How traumatizing would that be, even if someone knew that it wasn't the right choice for them, or they weren't able to keep the child? Um, so when young people's access to reproductive health is threatened, that can lead to feelings of anxiety, fear, frustration, and anger. There was a crisis text line that put out some data uh, from their services. It said since 2013. I couldn't find like when the article was put out, so I don't know how many years that was. But they did say that they had received 16,000 calls that used the word abortion, concerning relationships, depression, anxiety, isolation, and grief. And something they also did note is that those who sought this text line support to discuss pregnancy had been noted to bring up physical and emotional abuse on average higher than the general texter, which unfortunately, when we're looking at these situations, there is a connection with things like intimate partner violence. So those that were denied abortions were more likely to stay with abusive partners compared to those who were able to obtain one. And of course, that makes sense. You know, when you don't have, um, when you're put in that situation, you're probably more likely to stay with any support, even if it's support that is harmful to you. The APA, or American Psychological Association, does suggest that there's a relationship between unwanted pregnancies and intimate partner violence. Again, if we think about that, if we look in that situation, is that someone who is in an abusive relationship, they probably do not have as much choice or agency. They're being forced into things that they don't want to do or uncomfortable with, that may lead to unwanted pregnancies, putting them more at risk for all of these other mental health issues on top of whatever may be um, impacting them from being in an abusive dynamic. So, another big thing with this topic is the perceived stigma around abortion. This has been associated with thought suppression, intrusive thoughts, and psychological distress. So, we've got the fears of social judgment, self judgment. Sometimes this need for secrecy, social isolation, and the stigma can lead to an increased psychological distress and social isolation. One of the things that was being discussed with some of these changing laws is if people are having to potentially travel to access healthcare, or if their loved ones, even anyone that knows about what's happening, could be charged or criminalized, how much that puts someone in a very vulnerable mental health position, because they're not able to really speak openly or access the support in their lives, because it would potentially cause harm to those other people. And so it can be a very isolating position to be in. Another psychologist talked about the tendency in their research of women to label their actions as selfish if they are doing something that is counter or different from what others want them to do. and that they are doing something good if they're doing what other people want them to do. So this adds another layer of the complex to the complexity of decision making here, and how someone might interpret their own actions or might interpret other people's actions that can really interfere with receiving or giving support, and also make it very confusing of what does someone actually want to do or what should they do. Even if they kind of know what they want, they might really struggle with how this is going to impact other people around them and those relationships. So, another point around stigma that was brought up is that abortion in and of itself doesn't cause emotional distress. That there are normal feelings that come up. There can be some difficulty in making medical decisions, but that abortion stigma is what actually causes the psychological distress that people experience. So, if we were in a society that was really open and supportive of people making the healthcare decisions that were right for them, that there would not be this emotional distress that we're talking about, which is a real challenge to some of the um, anti choice or forced birth or anti abortion rhetoric that says that abortion itself causes so much psychological distress, that we're actually seeing in the research that it's more around this stigma that is causing the distress. So, the other thing to consider is that if an individual has experienced, has a history of excuse me, historical trauma, that this whole situation might be more intense. So, often, one way we can sometimes think about trauma, there's different types of trauma, but often people in traumatic situations experience a sense of lack of control, where something is happening to them that they don't want to happen to them, and they don't have full control in that situation. So then when we put someone in a situation where their bodily autonomy is threatened and they don't have full control to make the decisions that they want to make, to take care of themselves and make their choices in their life, that can cause even uh, more trauma, or can add even more trauma, and can also bring up those old wounds of that feeling of being out of control, um, and disconnection with their bodies, maybe even. So, this is another thing that was brought up. If we look at individuals with no prior mental health issues, those who experienced even unwanted pregnancy are at a 1.42 greater odds to have a depressive episode later in life than those with wanted pregnancy. So even when we're getting, and this is one way we can sort of think about the stigma and the impact, is that even someone going through an unwanted pregnancy, just even getting to that point, there is so much more risk potentially for psychological distress or later issues, because of all the stigma potentially because of all of the stigma surrounding these issues and all of the difficulties that someone is facing in terms of making this decision, or what led to them being in a position where they're experiencing an unwanted pregnancy, and how they're going to deal with that in terms of their life and moving forward. So, the other piece we can sort of consider when we're looking at some of the laws and the barriers and restrictions is that intertwined with things like economic inequality, racial discrimination, and gender-based violence can really significantly impact someone's mental health. So, if they're dealing with all of these pieces, and then on top of it, they're facing barriers to accessing care, that can um, compound the mental health impacts. So the barriers may impact or may require things like travel. There may be limited clinic options, financial issues, and restrictions that they're navigating. So those that are already impacted by things like poverty, lack of healthcare access, and racism in the healthcare system, that can really compound those mental health impacts. Um, a couple, and maybe this is just because I have some financial I think about financial stress and issues a lot, especially with the economy we're navigating, is that carrying an unwanted pregnancy to term quadrupled the odds a new mother and child would live below the poverty line. 5 years after seeking abortions, those who were refused were more likely than those who had an abortion to report not having enough money to cover basic living expenses. Bans lead to a drop in the monthly salaries for women of childbearing years. So, again, on top of navigating this healthcare issue and the potential consequences, people are being set up to have even more distress and stress on them by being put in a very difficult financial situation, and all of the stressors that comes with, all impacting their mental health. So the Turnaway study, which did a lot to look at some of these questions around abortions, they found that abortion does not increase the risk of suicidal ideation, PTSD, depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, or lower life satisfaction. And that women were really confident about their decisions. 95% say that the decision they made was right for them. Those that were denied abortion were more likely to suffer anxiety and the loss of self-esteem compared to those who were not denied. Um, those denied were more likely to face long-term financial hardships and physical health problems. Those forced to carry to term had lower credit scores, increased debt, more bankruptcies and evictions, worse child developmental outcomes, and a greater likelihood of child poverty, all of which, again, impacts mental health. So, in the overturning of Roe versus Wade, some of the mental health associations did put out statements about the potential impacts on mental health, and how that would impact people. I did see a little bit more from social workers in terms of thinking about this more broadly, this reproductive justice piece, or this is something that I came across from social workers. And I think it's because, in terms of their field, there is more of a focus on um, looking at systemic issues and social justice. Yes, it is acknowledged in other mental health fields. I think it's a little bit more fleshed out with social workers. But this was noted in some of the things that the ways that social workers can engage with reproductive justice. And I think you can see here again that piece where it's not maybe just the stereotype that we're thinking about just accessing abortion resources, that there's so many other pieces that are at play when we're thinking about reproductive justice and what may impact someone's access to those choices. So, looking at things like experiences with domestic violence, deportation, which is, again, speaking as a white person, I can't say fully from lived experience if that is something that really is changing um, on the ground, but it seems to be like it's such a push in the current administration to um, really increase this. So, of course, this is a huge issue that impacts reproductive justice. We're talking about pregnant people being forced into unhealthy situation or dangerous situations, children being put in dangerous situations, separated from their families, um, LGBTQ plus resources. This is another piece that's important. Social services, increasing someone's health literacy so that they know how to they can make informed healthcare decisions. Like they can read materials, they can understand more so what's going on in terms of making these healthcare decisions. So even things like that. Working on literacy, working on resources that are being translated into different um, languages. This can all impact someone's health-related decision makings and things like that. So I thought this was an interesting piece to kind of look at some of the other areas that we could kind of think about reproductive justice and the ways that mental health providers could support individuals in the community. So, what are some of the things that therapists can offer? So, the therapy space can really support clients in empowering and educating them. So, with so much misinformation out there and propaganda and politicized health information, it can be hard to get accurate information. And so, therapists can offer or direct clients towards reliable health information where they can get um, support or connect with providers that really know what's going on. That's unfortunately something that we're having to deal with places like pregnancy crisis centers that on the surface appear as healthcare organizations, but have been noted to mislead clients, give them false information. They're not actually fully healthcare providers or held to the same standards. And so this puts clients in a very difficult position in terms of knowing what's going on, knowing their options. And with more of these restrictions, time is of the essence in terms of getting care, helping people to find their voice. So, because of those impacts of stigma, like we talked about, it can be hard for someone to really know what they want to do. It's not our job as therapists to tell people what to do, but to maybe help people parse out what do they actually want to do when there are these different voices and perspectives about what they should do. We can also help people with navigating experiences of discrimination and advocacy. If there's any resources that could support them with those experiences, building support systems and communities so they have more resources, feeling less isolated. Working on embodied or somatic practices. So, again, like I was mentioning before, with traumatic experiences, often people um, there's some kind of disconnect that happens, disconnection or disassociation. When we have experiences where something is happening to us that we don't want to be happening to us, or something that should be happening is not happening, because that's another way trauma can look in terms of things like a neglect and lack of support. Um, Often our nervous systems come up with strategies to be somewhere else, to do something to distract us, to get our minds off of it, to be somewhere else because being in the body is too painful. And so, one of the things that we can work on with therapy is helping people to reconnect to their bodies and reconnect to themselves and honoring themselves again, even after they've experienced some very difficult experiences that have led to that disconnection. Another way that I look at what we can do is another piece from somatic therapy called pendulation, which is basically, um, when we're navigating these situations that are very stressful for us, and what we're facing personally and what we are observing when we look around at society and all of these challenging things that are happening, is that it can be easy again to disconnect and look away and disengage. And there's many downsides to that. One is that we don't address the issues that need to be addressed in our society, but also we may be operating in a way that is not in line with our values, and that can lead to even more distress. And so things like pendulation, where we learn about our nervous systems and how to support our nervous systems, where we can go into something a little bit and then come out, go into it a little bit and come out. So you're kind of going in, dealing with facing that distress, being with it with her a little bit, and then coming out as your nervous system needs some space to breathe. And so working on learning more about our own nervous systems and different ways to support our nervous systems and build our capacity is also something that we can do in therapy. Hopefully in the therapy space, we are creating safe spaces for people to discuss these feelings and experiences. One of the challenges that we deal with in therapy is that there has been this historical big push to depoliticize therapy and say that it's harmful to clients to um, focus on these political things and that we just need to stay out of it. But when we are looking at it from even this research that we've just gone through, is that these issues, like, yes, they are political, they're politicized, but that they are also very tangible things that have a significant impact on people's mental health. And that it is really important for us to create a safe space that is in line with our ethics and values as it's listed here. One therapist was bringing up really these ethics of autonomy and justice that are very much part of the mental health field, and that being engaged and offering safe spaces and really supporting our clients in this way really is in line with our professions. We can also be a space to sort of help people to reflect on the impact of the messaging and legislation. Again, even if you are not directly experiencing something, if you're witnessing that happening to other people, that can contribute to uh, PTSD or significant distress. And so, the idea that these things are happening, the experience that these things are happening in our community where people are being cut off from access to healthcare, they're being put in very difficult, challenging experiences, that can still really impact mental health and be something that we work with in therapy. So, in thinking about this topic, I went through and I thought about, and of course, there may be more, but these are some of the areas where this topic, broad topic, has been brought up in my therapy sessions with clients. So, I just wanted to note a few of these. One is uh, trans access to medical care. That has been a huge issue for my clients and their communities. And thinking about, how do I access care? Do I need to move? Do I need to relocate to get basic medical services? Some of the laws that changed have made it very hard to access care, as many providers in the state were cut off from offering um, certain resources or certain medical care to clients. So this is a consideration. I also wanted to note things with like the loss of rights and things like climate change, parents really worrying about, what does the future look like for my children, or should I even have children? What might happen if I did need care, like for people even that wanted to have children, is like, what would it look like if something happened and they needed emergency medical care? Would they have access to that? Um, Thinking about the horrific situations in places like Palestine and Congo, where children are facing starvation, mutilation, violence, um, things like that. But also being afraid for children's safety here. And is it safe to go to temple? Is it safe to go to school? So there's a lot of pieces here when um, that people are bringing in to therapy in this topic. The other piece that I wanted to note was the ACEs study, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. So this is a pretty it's like a seminal work study that really talked about how they can chart if a child had, or if you as a child had certain adverse experiences, like, was there abuse in the home? Was there substance use issues in the home? Things like that, they can look at statistically, you're more likely as adults to develop medical conditions. So these things really do have an impact. And so when we're bringing children into situations where that are under resourced, they are put maybe in a more vulnerable position to experiencing some of these things when they're not coming into a situation where they're really wanted, or the resources are not there to support them. The other piece I wanted to note with this that's often not talked about is I would say that many of my, and sort of thinking about, why do people make the choices they do around reproduction? Like one of the main areas we're talking about here is with abortion. But also, if we go a little bit further and think about why people even have children, people that want to have children, why do they choose to do that? And what plays into their decision making within the social context that we have? And I would say that many of the clients that I work with have experienced being unwanted. It wasn't because of the situation where abortion was on the table and the parents wanted abortion, but that the parents had certain expectations of how their children were supposed to be, and that didn't line up with who their children were. That's a maybe a simplified way of looking at it. Um, but I think that's also something to sort of consider as we're looking at these topics is what plays into socially why people choose to have children, and is that really is that really with what they're thinking and why they're choosing to do this? Is it because they're like, I want to love this child for whoever they come out into the world as? And if it's not that, then why are they having those children, and how that plays into significant mental health impacts in our society? Have the parents done the work to be emotionally mature and available and supportive of whoever their children end up being? And I don't hear this talked about a lot, but I think that is also an interesting sort of way of thinking about these issues as well, because some of the reasons that people may feel that stigma or pressure to um, have the children, is that also some of the reasons why people feel that they want to decide to have children generally, and is that in the best interests of those children? And if not, who is it in the interest of? So if you know me, I'm going to talk about decolonization because it is, as I mentioned in the beginning, but it is my special interest. And it is a way of really contextualizing and understanding so many things that are playing out in an individual, in a family system, in a community, in our society. And I don't have, in this shortened workshop, I didn't put a lot in this, but if you don't know about decolonization, I would definitely encourage you to look it up. And if you don't think it applies to you, if you just think it's something in the past, particularly speaking to white people here, I would definitely encourage you to look into this. And if you follow my page, there's going to be more information, excuse me, over time. I'm going to be putting more and more out over more out about decolonization. It's not just an issue of the past, it is happening today. It's not just an issue that people of color or Indigenous people are facing, it is deeply impacting white people as well. So it does apply to you. Educate yourself. Feel free to reach out to me if you are in a space where you're open to learning and want to learn more. If you're just wanting to argue because your nervous system is uncomfortable with this possibility, there's plenty of other spaces to do that online. So, some of the things that I thought about briefly that we could pull and sort of thinking about things from this decolonization perspective is sitting with this, like, what is the context and lineage of what we are seeing right now? How does our proximity to whiteness play out in our relationship to bodies, reproduction, family, and sexuality, etc.? How do the values of colonization interplay with this? I see in therapy that most of my work, which is unfortunately not acknowledged by most in the field, that most of what therapy is working with all the ways people's relationships have been colonized. Where different bodies fall on the white supremacy hierarchy determines how the systems respond to those bodies and reproduction. Who is more or less human? So, like I mentioned before, what communities are being more affected by pollution? Where are we putting the pollution? Where are we putting the really harmful things? Predominantly in communities of color and communities with lower income, and where violence is targeting more people. So when we're thinking about this idea of like who is more or less human, like who deserves a healthy, safe pregnancy? Who is risking their life when they become pregnant and they try to seek medical care? Who is told that their traditional practices are um, illegal? Who is told that, or who are we okay with them suffering through a really painful pregnancy in a war zone with their healthcare facilities destroyed without access to medications and medical supplies? If we're looking at the pregnant people, looking at the children, which children do we consider innocent and believe that they should have all the things to be able to play and um, have access to education and medical care? And which children are we okay with being separated from their families that we're viewing as criminals, or um, just okay with putting in cages or blowing them up, or um, you know, all kinds of horrible things. And so when we're looking at things like reproduction and pregnant people and children, like how do we view them? And where is that coming from? That we are more okay with some of these people being targeted with violence, with these people being impacted by harmful pollutants in their communities. Um, One therapy concept or um, theory is the power threat meaning model, which is basically, this is a big concept, but that power is being exerted on us in our society, in these systems. And whether or not we're conscious of it, our nervous systems are perceiving them and perceiving the threats and making meaning out of it in order to deal with and navigate and survive those systems. And so we're navigating things like these threats of violence and social pressure and stigma. And that there may be these internal conflicts that we experience with autonomy, our values, and seeking our sense of safety, all the while our nervous systems are actively seeking safety, security, and stability in the system that is often dehumanizing to so many people. So, all of that right there has a huge mental health impact and physical health impact, and has a huge impact on how we choose to live our lives. And what choices are accessible to us. So part of the system is that relationships are turned into resources for extraction and wealth accumulation. So community and valuing relationship is a barrier to that process. So one of the things we can think about is really looking critically at the way that we relate to our bodies individually and communally, and how some of this how some of this process of our relationships being turned into resources plays out even into our most basic relationship which is our relationship to our body, and all of these other pieces that might play out with reproductive justice and healthcare. So again, there's so much more that we could get into here, but just a little bit of maybe some considerations along these lines. So, some resources. So, one of the things that was noted is that most people don't need therapy related to their abortion experiences, but many may want to discuss their experiences. So, again, the abortion itself is not super emotionally distressing. And they may want to discuss what happened. Pro-choice therapists is a listserv of vetted therapists. I'm currently going through that process. They have a pretty extensive questionnaire. Um, Exhale Pro-Choice offers free peer counseling. All Options also offers free peer counseling, but goes into more expanded topics like pregnancy, parenting, and adoption. Faith Out Loud has spiritual support options, and then abortionswelcome.org has spiritual support tools for processing experiences. And these are some of my references. And a little bit more ways to contact me. This is my website and email. Um, if you want to buy me coffee, it's there. And then obviously you're here at my um, YouTube account. So feel free to reach out if you want to talk more about decolonizing topics. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it was helpful, and feel free to check out the other videos as well. And thank you.